church or a breakdown church and you want to serve in one of those ways, just reach out to the eldership or their wives. They can help you out with that. So feel free to get involved. We love an involved church.
Today will be selected readings from the Gospels. The beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in the prophets, "Behold, I send my messenger before thy face, which shall prepare thy way before thee. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. For as much as many have taken in hand to set forth in order a declaration of those things which are most surely believed among us, even as they delivered them unto us, which from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, it seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write them in order. Now the birth of Jesus Christ was on this wise, when, as his mother Mary was espoused to Joseph, before they came together, she was found with child of the Holy Ghost. And behold, the angel of the Lord appeared unto Joseph in a dream, saying, Joseph, thou son of David, fear not to take unto thee Mary thy wife, for that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Ghost. And she shall bring forth a son, and thou shalt call his name Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. He was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name, which were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word was made flesh, and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. This is the word of the Lord.
Good job. Excellent job, Missy. Thank you very much. And all of you, singing was very good today. I appreciate all of you who come together and put out a lot of effort to make this work on Sundays for all of us. We're all very appreciative. So we're going to start a new series today called The Epic of Jesus. It's going to be primarily about the Gospel of Mark. We're going to be looking at the Gospel of Mark and a number of different passages, pericopes out of the Gospel of Mark over the next few weeks. Today we're not going to look at any of those particular texts. We're going to examine why we're doing this first. So today I'm going to explain what it is we're going to be doing going forward. Starting next week, we'll actually start diving into the actual text of Mark and looking at a number. We're not going to look at the entire book, every single section, but we're going to go through in some selected sections and look at them, and we'll start that next week. But this week I want to try to lay the ground, or try to explain why. So like 3 weeks ago, those of you that were here when I preached the sermon on learning in the spirituality series, I pointed out that there was a difference between Eastern and Western teaching, or styles of teaching, and I made the argument that the style that Jesus employed was different than either one. He wasn't Western and he wasn't Eastern, and that he had a very different objective about him, and that led to him teaching differently. And I did that intentionally, laying the groundwork for us to come to this. So I want to expand a little bit on that and try to explain why it is I said that and what that means. The reason why Jesus' teaching is different is because he desires us to learn him, right? Not about him, although that's good, and not from him, and that's certainly good as well, but Jesus intended us to learn him, and we're going to look at that a little deeper today. But this learning Jesus is a reciprocal response that is really tied to the doctrine of the Trinity. We learn Christ reciprocally, in other words, as a response that he learned us. And that's what we're taught in the scriptures, that Jesus Christ took upon himself flesh, and he learned what it was to be like us. In Hebrews it says, puts it this way, he says, he learned obedience, right? And so we find in the scriptures that Jesus Christ, as God manifest in the flesh, learned you. And now he wants you to reciprocate and learn him. He became like you so that you could then become like him. And that's his challenge to us, and we're supposed to respond in kind. And the way Jesus taught is tied, directly tied, right, inextricably tied to that goal, to that objective, to learn him. The problem is we're Westerners, right? We have a Western mindset, and we don't think that way. We think in ways of data, facts, statistics, right? Evidence, proof, arguments, doctrines. What are the teachings? What are the building blocks of the foundation of Christianity? And we think that way, very structured. Jesus Christ, there's nothing wrong with any of that. And I'm not here rebuking that. I'm just saying that his overall goal of Christ was not that. Was not that. That's all good. There's a lot of that in the Bible. The epistles are a lot about that. But when we get to the Gospels, we find a form of literature unlike the epistles. If you've read the Gospels and really paid attention, then you know right away there is a marked difference between the way the Gospels are written, that form of literature, and what we have in all the rest of the New Testament practically, which are mainly the epistles, right? The epistles, a lot of doctrine, a lot of explanation, a lot of argumentation. And if you're someone like me, that's mother's milk for you. I love the epistles. Right? I just roll around in them. I love them. I love the argumentation. I love the logic. I love everything about them. And yet when you get to the Gospels, all of that comes to a grinding halt. And if you're like me, you're wondering, where did these come from? And that is actually a question that scholars have puzzled about. The Gospels are a very peculiar form of writing, not just within the context of the New Testament. The Gospels, as we'll see in a little bit, are very peculiar in any context. So the Scriptures are unique. The whole Bible is unique when you compare it to any of the holy books. So if you compare it to the Quran, or the Bhagavad Gita, or you compare it to whatever holy book you want to compare it to, the Bible is very, very unique. It's far more of a narrative form of a book than any of the other ones. You find them to be very, if you read the Quran, it's very doctrinal, right? It's do this and don't do this, and this is what God likes, and this is what God doesn't like. And there's certainly a fair share of that in the Bible, but the Bible is by far and large, a narrative book. It is the story of this person who traveled over here, and this person did this, and this person begat so-and-so, and there's entire chapters of so-and-so begat so-and-so, begat so-and-so, and begat so-and-so. You got entire books of the Bible that don't seem to be telling us any doctrine. You have whole books of the Bible that don't even mention God, like Esther. Very, very odd book the Bible is. And yes, we can take many of these narrative stories and draw out of them, right, moral lessons. And as Western evangelicals, we are certainly often guilty of drawing a little too deep moral lessons out of some of these stories, trying to make them mean something. And often what we make them mean is what we would have them to mean, not what's actually there. Because some of these stories, they don't seem to have any moral lesson. At least no good moral lesson. Right? So you have Lot, and Lot goes to Sodom, and then Lot wife's turned to salt, and then Lot runs off into a cave, and then he commits incest, and let's draw a moral lesson. This is very, very hard. It's like, what's going on here? And there's a lot of criticism in the world of the Bible because of all the horrible things that it relates that don't seem to say it's bad. It doesn't seem to say it's not acceptable. It just lays it out there. And you're left wondering, what's this about? Well, that's very interesting how the Bible is written. And within the Scriptures, the Gospels are exceptionally unique. Now, the Bible and the Gospels have resonated for 2,000 years with people or more. The Bible as a whole for much more than that. And the Gospels for 2,000 years have resonated with people. And this is why, and it's because that's how we talk about ourselves. We talk about ourselves the way the Scriptures talk about God, in stories. Right? We don't get together at the family reunion and have a class. This is where the family came from, memorize this, and this is what we stand on, and here are our 7 principles, and here are our 3 founding foundations. No, we don't do that. We get around and we play dominoes and we tell stories. Or if you're a sinner family, you play face cards, right? You play poker cards if you're a sinner family, right? But we tell stories. Remember when Uncle so-and-so, ah, ha, ha, yeah, and I remember that, and we tell stories to each other. We mentioned this a few weeks ago in the learning sermon, but that's how we talk about ourselves in story format. And this is one reason why the Bible resonates like this, like it does. And that's how the Gospels largely communicate the message of Christ in story format. And it's an interesting way because what you have is you have stories within stories. So Jesus walked on the earth and told a lot of stories. His preaching was predominantly, or at least very much so, storytelling. And we'll get to that in a minute also. But he told stories, and then the gospel writers wrote those stories down and edited them, compacted them, compressed them, expanded them. And they were telling a story with those stories, and then they put them all together into an overall overarching art. We'll call it the arc story. So you have a story within a story within a story at the very least. So it's a lot of layers of storytelling. Now, if I know some we're going to hear stories and say, oh, you mean fiction. No, I don't mean fiction. I mean stories in the same way we still tell stories about George Washington or Abraham Lincoln or your uncle, Goober, or whatever his name is, right? Not talking to the rednecks. Okay, maybe I am. So we tell these stories. It doesn't mean they're fiction, but they are stories. They're things that we repeat orally, we recount, we retell. And what do we do when we get together, like in a reunion, and tell stories? Well, we also correct those stories. Right? The story gets told, and it gets a little better sometimes, and then there's always that stickler, right, for a detail. No. It was 10 inches, not 37 inches, or whatever, right? You always got the Debbie Downer, going to make sure everyone tells the story right, but that's how the stories between everyone get corrected. Now, the New Testament is a story, or the Gospels are a story like no other story. They really are. Just as the Bible as a whole is unlike any other book, the Gospels are a story unlike any story. So there's a fair share in the Gospels of fantastical elements that you would often find in mythological fiction, for instance. So if you go and read the Arthurian tales, the tales of King Arthur, or if you were to go read about Prester John, or if you were to go read the travelogue, an old travelogue called The Wonders of the East, well, you're going to get real fantastical tales about all kinds of crazy creatures and crazy things that happen, and miracles and signs and wonders. And when you read the Gospels, if you're a lazy reader, if you're quick to jump on and dismiss the Bible, well, then you'll think, well, the Gospels are like that. These people, a lot time later, fictionalized the life of Jesus and made up a bunch of stuff. You cannot read the Gospels, in my opinion, honestly, and conclude that whatsoever. At all. And it's not because we say, no, by faith we believe that these things happen. Yes, that's true, but that's not why. You cannot conclude that because that is not at all what it looks like when you really do read the Gospels. If you go and compare, read the Wonders of the East, or the books written about the King Prester John, or the Kingdom of Prester John, and read those and compare those to the New Testament, they are nothing alike. Go and read the tales of Augustus Caesar and how he's supposedly the son of the God and all of that, and read that and compare that to the New Testament and to the Gospels. They're nothing alike, nothing at all alike. The Gospel narrative presents the wonders, the miracles, the signs of Jesus. They do talk about them unabashedly, unapologetically, but in an extremely restrained manner. Very attenuated. We read the Gospels, and if you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all together, you get this impression that this is like, how in the world could anyone not believe in Jesus? Look at all this. You do realize that you are privy to far more information about the miracles of Jesus than practically anyone, including some of his apostles, were at that time. Only very few people saw even a portion of all those miracles. Jesus went up and transfigured himself on the Mount of Transfiguration. 3 people only saw that. Jesus took a blind man and spit and made mud and put it on his eyes. Nobody saw that. Apparently, Jesus retold it to his apostles, told them what happened, because it says he took them by the hand and led them out of town, away from everybody. Jesus was not out trying to perform miracles so everyone could see him. Now, there were plenty of signs he did that many people saw, or at least saw the effects of them. But think about the famous miracle of Jesus turning water into wine. Nobody actually saw him do this. The servants knew where the water came from, it says. No one else knew anything, had no clue what had happened, didn't even suspect anything. So we now have an account in the Gospels of all of these things that were later on put together. And people who saw something said, hey, I saw this, and they'd write that down. And another person, well, I saw this, and they put together all these stories, and now we have this huge corpus of miracles and signs, and we think, well, you couldn't possibly see all that, right, and be dismissive of Christ. But very few people, if anyone, saw all that. Very few. Because Jesus his goal was not to wow the world with signs and miracles. In fact, we find Jesus very much diminishing the value of these. So the apostles go out and they do their fair share of some miracles when he sends out the 70, and they come back glad and happy and rejoicing, and Jesus basically kind of downs on the party. He kind of rains on the parade. He says, don't rejoice in that. Rejoice in that your name is written in heaven. We cannot suspect that Jesus was any less or any more joyful about true value than he was admonishing the apostles to be as well. In fact, Jesus told them in John 14, he says, that those that would follow him would do greater works than he had done. And then you have the times when the Gospels document where miracles and signs were not forthcoming. It says that when Jesus returned to his hometown, he could not do many great works there because of their unbelief. We have the time when he led the man out of town, and Jesus apparently recounting the story because it doesn't seem to have been any other witnesses present, or maybe the man told the apostles the story, but whoever did said, look, he healed me. I didn't see real well, and then he healed me again. That's a very odd story to tell if you're trying to create this mythical Jesus that you find in Augustus Caesar or Prester John. None of these things fit the narrative. And then the widespread disbelief after the miracles. There is no falling down widespread by the entire population saying, oh, this must be God. He would feed everyone, and they would immediately fall into disbelief. He would stand up and calm the tempest, and it wasn't just a few hours later, and he's rebuking the same people for not believing. This is a very peculiar book that documents all these shortcomings, that minimizes or at least attenuates all of these miracles and signs, doesn't make nearly the issue you think it would of them, and rather puts the focus on other things that are far less tangible and far less exotic or incredible. And that's how the Gospels are written. And there's no other book like that written. I've read a lot of books. And there's no other book that I find that's written like this. I mean, why would you write a book like that unless that's exactly how it happened? I want to get a little bit into the geeky part of this, and some of you are not going to like it, and that's okay. And we'll pick up in a few minutes where you might like it a little better. But let's talk a little bit about one of my favorite subjects, paragraphs, chapters, and verses. The reason why is because, as I've pointed out many times, and most of you are probably tired of hearing it, the Bible was not written with chapters and verses. These are later developments, right, in order to organize the text and make it a lot easier to use. Wonderful little things. They're not how it was written. It's not how they were intended to be read. But there is a way that they were very early on divided up. And it's what is now called pericopes. We call them passages. They're not exactly chapters. Chapters generally, especially in the narrative parts of the Bible, like the Gospels, there will be several pericopes per chapter, generally speaking. A pericope is a word that means a segment. Right? It comes from two words, right? Peri and kopi, which means cut around. So it means basically to cut out a piece. It's building blocks. And then the Gospels, this is very clear. Have you noticed in the Gospels how they seem kind of disjointed? It's just like it jumps. It's a story and it's all together and it's very, it all fits together and it flows. And then all of a sudden, there's another one. And there doesn't seem to be any real connective tissues there. Now, Mark is interesting. So when you read Mark, he uses the word "and" more than probably any other New Testament writer. He connects everything with an "and." It's almost immature in its way of writing. It's the way children tell stories. I was riding my bike, and then I saw someone with a dog, and then I fell down, and then a bird flew by, and then. That's how children tell stories. And. And when you read Mark, that's exactly how it's written. I'm not diminishing it. I think it's wonderful. I think it's a fabulous way of writing. It's very quick. It's very vivid. It's very... it's like someone who's just enthralled with the story and is just telling it as fast as they can possibly tell it. And so almost the entire thing, all the other writers will use, because Greek is like that, you need to connect everything that's in the same story, you connect together with words like and, then, when, so on. Mark almost doesn't use any more sophisticated word. He uses the simplest word you can possibly use to do it. And. If you turned in that as a term paper in college, I guarantee it would be kicked back right away. You are not allowed to start every sentence with the word "and." Does not permit it. But that's how Mark is basically written. And what they've done is they got these building blocks, and he very roughly puts them all together, not necessarily in chronological order at all. And that's not just Mark, that's all the Gospels are not necessarily in chronological order. And he put them all together, right? And every one of those building blocks are what we call nowadays, we call them a pericope. And so, for instance, a very famous one that is actually known by that term is called the pericope adulterae, or the adulterer's pericope. That's John 8, 1 through 11. That's where they bring out the woman to stone her, and Jesus writes on the ground, and then he says, "Who's ever without sin, cast the first stone." That's a pericope. And all the Gospels, that's what they are. The entire Gospels, they're all divided up into these little segments of text, and you can take each little block and look at it separately. And that's how they were intended to be looked at in some ways. And so what we have in the Gospels is not just all these little building blocks put together, but what we have is that they have been very carefully and very deliberately assembled, not only together, but in that order. Now, it's very obvious, it's very clear that they're not in chronological order. You can go and look, and if you read them, it doesn't take a lot of inspection to realize these are not intended to be in chronological order, and there's no mistake being made here. There's a reason they're not in chronological order. There's a reason why the death of John the Baptist is a what do they call it? Is a flashback in all the Gospels. We don't actually know exactly when John the Baptist died. It doesn't actually tell the story in chronological order. We can say, okay, here in the life of Jesus is when this happened. It always happens in flashback, and it may be, as far as I can find, it's one of the earliest flashbacks in literature where you have that genre, or the rhetorical device, I should say, being used. Because they're not in chronological order. What are they doing? Why are they assembling all these blocks the way they are? Because they're telling a story. Not only are they telling the stories of the blocks, but when we put all the blocks together, the whole thing is telling one story. It is wrong, and I think it dismissive, disrespectful, to assume that Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, that they just happened upon this structure. First off, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are almost identical in their structure. So this isn't like Mark just did it that way and everyone followed. Because we see deliberate, intentional changing a little bit, but between those three Gospels, the structure is practically identical. So there's a reason for that structure. Now, we could assume that they're just rubes and don't know what they're doing, but these are people who live their life in story. Think about that. This is a time when there was very little literacy, especially outside of the Jews, right? In the Gentile world, literacy was like almost zero, unless you were way up, unless you were very a noble, and even many of the nobles were illiterate. The way they kept their culture, the way they brought together their families, the way they had their society organize their culture, was all by telling their stories. They were master storytellers. The idea that these master storytellers just very nonchalantly threw together all these pericopes, almost like they put them all in like dice in a cup, a Yahtzee cup, and threw them out on the page, that's not what happened at all. And there's plenty of internal evidence that that's not the case. Now, we have these Gospels that are written as stories, and that makes it difficult for us often to identify with them. We read the Gospels, we get the gist of what's going on, we look at individual ones, we take individual pericopes, and we turn them into some doctrine, right? Like the prodigal son, poor story, has been mangled out of recognition by evangelicals. It's just sad what's been done to this. Right? That's what we do, because the way they're written, very, very difficult for people like us that don't consider ourselves storytelling people. Right? We think we're scientific. We're analytical. We're calculating. Right? We want evidence to be presented. We want the case to be made. We want a verdict on a judgment on it, and all scientific. I know we like to think of ourselves that way because we live in the scientific age, but actually there's very, very few people who are actually scientists, and they're only scientists in a very narrow way at a very particular time. You'd be surprised to find what scientists will do outside of their fields. I was just reading a book by a man who has a doctorate in ancient Semitic religions, and he was talking about how he would go and buy every type of diet pill that came out on the market and cream and everything because he didn't want to quit eating chocolate. You think, how could someone who is scientifically minded be that foolish? Because we all are. Because when it came to food, he told himself a story. So you may think you're analytical and scientific, but you're really not nearly as much as you think you are. We're creatures of narrative. We tell ourselves stories all the time. In fact, the only thing that really resonates with any of us are stories. This is why professional wrestling is far more popular than Olympic wrestling. Even though we all know that it's far less good wrestling. But they have stories, and professional wrestling got popular when they started telling a story, when they had villains and heroes, heels and faces, right? And they had these different parties, and they had tribes, and when it became narrative, it became popular. And you know what the Olympics have done in order to try to compete? They're all about story now too. It's not how fast can she ski, it's how much adversity did she overcome to get here. And you got to watch a 20-minute infomercial on all her horrible life that she overcame to become a skier so that you'll be interested in watching them ski because you like story. Now, you may not like that story, and you may think, well, but you like story. Our news is story, and I'm not talking about fake news or whatever. I'm telling you, news is story. We don't want to hear about the hurricane. We want someone interviewed how the hurricane impacted them. Just filming the wind isn't interesting. You got to go find somebody that's standing, some goober standing with chest deep in water. What do you think? Oh, everything's washed away. That's the news we turn in to see. Everything is story. We like movies that are story, and the stories within stories resonate the deepest. Forrest Gump is one of the biggest money-making movies, especially of its genre, and it is especially high-earning in domestic. Half of its gross was domestic. And when you watch Forrest Gump, it's a very strange set of stories. Just this guy who bumbles from event to event to event, and he happens to be in every major event, and if you really think about it, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But it does when you think what the actual arc narrative is. Forrest Gump is the American spirit. And it's how we as Americans see ourselves on the world stage, portrayed or personified in Forrest Gump. And you may not have realized it, but that's what resonates. When you watch it and you like Forrest Gump, that's why you like Forrest Gump. Video games have story. Gone are the days of Pac-Man with no narrative. In fact, if you have a game like Angry Birds with no narrative, they then make a narrative for it afterwards. And then they make a movie about it. Because we're not that interested anymore in just video games. We want video games with a story, with a narrative. Jonathan Gottschall points out in his book, The Storytelling Animal, speaking of, obviously you can tell he's an atheist, but he wrote a book called The Storytelling Animal, and he points out that the importance of story for human beings is evident in all children. Children live in storyland, or what he calls Neverland. They tell themselves stories all day long. Everything turns into a villain, a fight, a princess, a castle. And we think, yeah, but we grew up. No, we didn't. You know that running chatter that you have in your brain? That when you pay attention, you hear it constantly talking? That's you living in storyland. When you're sitting alone driving and you're talking to yourself, what are you talking about? You're telling yourself stories. How you're going to answer that person. how you're going to fix that part, how you're going to decorate that room. And you retell the story and retell the story until you find a narrative that resonates. Your dreams, your nightmares, that's you living in storyland. That's your brain telling you stories. So the idea that somehow we've outgrown the need of narrative, that we no longer live that way, that's not true. We suppress it, right? We don't all go around dressed like Sir Galahad in the street. But in our heads, we do tell ourselves a story. That's why when you see yourself in a picture, it doesn't resemble what you thought you looked like that morning in the mirror. Because in the mirror, you're telling yourself a story. And you pose and pinch those cheeks and flex those butt cheeks until you tell the story you want to hear. Problem is the photograph doesn't collaborate. You know what gossip is? You know what conspiracy theories are? They're stories. It's where you take a few facts and you weave them into a giant narrative. Having said all that, you need to understand that there's a real purity in a story. Way above doctrine or didactic form of presentations. Stories have a real purity to them. They're an inoculation against hypocrisy. They're very important, especially when it comes to religion. Doctrine is incredibly susceptible to hypocrisy. When you teach doctrine with no story, right, then what you do is you tell people, as the Pharisees did, what they should and shouldn't do, but not with one finger do you lift that weight. Jesus didn't have a lot of doctrine. I don't mean he wasn't doctrinal, but he told a lot of stories. And you know what his stories tell us? That he had experience in what he was talking about. Whenever I hear someone try to use a sermon illustration on construction, I cringe. Because generally they don't know what they're talking about. It's like when a white boy actor tries to talk Spanish in a movie. If you know Spanish, you know that boy don't know Spanish. You could say the Pharisees had sermons and Jesus had stories. Now, if that sounds weak to you, then you don't understand the power of a narrative. The power of coming and telling somebody from life experience something they can identify with. So Jesus comes and he has this huge, this is one of the primary problems of his ministry, and probably still of today, but certainly of Jesus Christ. He wanted to save the publicans, the harlots, the sinners, he wanted to save them. And the religious elites were not happy about that. They wanted Jesus for them. They wanted to pontificate. They wanted to sit there and talk about doctrine and kick back ideas. And Jesus wanted to save sinners. And they weren't happy. And when sinners got saved, they were angry about it. And so Jesus tells them a story. We call it the prodigal son. That's what that story's about. And to tell them that story, he helps them tell their story first and says, any of you have ever lost money? I bet you do this. I bet you take everything out. I bet you sweep the whole house until you find that coin, don't you? And they go, oh yeah, you bet we do. And when you find it, you're super happy, aren't you? They go, you bet we are. We throw a party when we find it. You may think that's silly, but how do you act when you find a $100 bill on the ground somewhere? Or in your pockets from the wash and you didn't know you had it? You're super happy. You go celebrate at Dairy Queen. And how many of you are shepherds? And they raise their hand. And what do you do when you lose a sheep? I know what you do because I've lived around shepherds my whole life. I have a story to tell you about what happens when a shepherd loses a sheep, and they resonate. They say, that's right. That's exactly what we do. We don't allow no sheep to be lost. We're good shepherds. So I want to tell you a story about a man that had 2 sons. And he told a story that is so true and so resonating that we still tell that story today. It's probably one of the most told stories in all of history. Because every part of it resonates. Because he didn't have a sermon that he had prepared. He had a story that he had lived. And when he told the story, they were so convicted they didn't know what to do or say. He didn't just make up stories. Jesus didn't sit around and think up illustrations or have a little illustration book. Jesus had lived a full life around the people he was dealing with, and he could talk to them in a story that they could understand. And unlike the stories of all those other books I mentioned, those mythical books that you'll find in the 10th and 11th century, 12th century, the stories of Jesus aren't fantastical. They're not mythological. He doesn't have crazy visions or animals with different parts. He left that all up to John. Jesus' stories are simple. They're coins, they're sheep, they're 2 sons, they're trees and fruit and wheat and tares. Things that everyone identified with and could understand. He told stories about women losing coins, shepherd losing sheep. He told a story about a rich man and a beggar named Lazarus. But he told a more important story than all of those. He told his story. In all of those stories, he was telling a bigger story. That's what the Gospels are telling us. The Gospels are not telling us about sheep and coins and wheat and tares. They're telling us the story of Jesus. In all of those stories. That's why they're put together. Jesus was telling a different story. They took all his stories, they put them together, and when we look at them, it's like one of those images that you see that it looks like the face of the actor in the movie, but when you get close, it's made up of tiny little picture scenes from the movie that when you see it from a distance, become the poster of the movie. You have all these little stories, and they all are meaningful and true. I'm not diminishing any of them. The big story wouldn't exist without the little stories. But when we get so focused in, when we get so drawn in, and we're only looking at the little stories, we don't see the larger narrative. Jesus was the story that he told. He's the ultimate story. He's not just facts or good words. He's the logos, the word. That's what John says. In the beginning was the Word. The story, the narrative. It was a story that the Father told. The Father's the great author. Written by the great writer, the Holy Spirit. And Jesus is the word of that story. He's the message of that story. He's the narrative of that story. So having said that, what are the role of the Gospels in this narrative? So the Gospels, as far as I can tell, do at least 3 things. Probably do more, but there's at least 3 things that you can see that the Gospels are doing. One is they document the nature of things believed by the followers of Jesus. That's what Luke says. He said, I'm going to write to you the things that for us are certain. So they document what the followers of Jesus believed was said, believed happened. These are the stories of Jesus that we know to be true. That's what the first thing they do. The second thing is they substantiate the doctrinal development of the apostles, primarily Paul. He was the troublemaker, right? So Paul comes along and he has this doctrinal development nobody's sure about. Hey, we're going to go preach to all the Gentiles. Like, where are you getting that from? Matthew particularly clarifies This is not an innovation of Paul. This comes directly from Jesus. He said it over and over and over in his ministry. We can document what he said. We know what he said. This is not anything new or untoward. This is of Jesus. And it's not just that. You can track almost every single doctrine of the New Testament epistles right back to the words of Christ, almost all of them to the Sermon on the Mount. So that's a very important part of the Gospels, because Paul says that if we don't speak according to the words of Christ, right, then we know nothing. It's very important. We do not follow Paul. Right, Linda? I got you. Follow Jesus. Follow Jesus. Very important, and that's what the Gospels do. Without the Gospels, then all we have are the apostles' own explanations with no foundation to support them. So it does do those things. But there's one thing they do above all else, I think more important even than those, which are very important. And that is that the Gospels infuse believers with the mind of Christ. It's what I said at the beginning. In the Gospels, we learn Christ. Not we learn the word of Christ or the doctrines of Christ or the teachings of, yes, but no. We learn Christ. Probably one of the oldest writings we have in the Bible, at least some scholars believe so, it seems to me to be at least arguably the case, is in Philippians. Philippians is one of the early books of the Bible, probably. And he then, in it, appears to quote what was already a well-known writing in the church. Philippians 2, it says, "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus." That's Paul, most likely. Or no, Paul wrote this, but that's probably his wording. And this is what he's quoting, it seems like. "Who, being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, took upon him the form of a servant, was made in the likeness of man, and being found in a fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. Wherefore God also hath highly exalted him and given him a name which is above every name, that in the name of Jesus every knee should bow, of things in heaven and things in earth and things under the earth, and that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father." Why do we have these gospel narratives that seem to have so little doctrinal content in the way we as Westerners expect it? Because it has the greatest doctrinal content, too often overlooked by evangelicals like us, like me. It is the content of the character, the nature of Jesus Christ. How do you learn somebody? Not about them, not their facts, not their birth date, not their favorite color. In fact, in the Gospels we have, and this is very interesting, we have no description of Jesus. None. Because that would distract us from the description we should be seeing. And that was, who was Jesus? And the gospel narrative tells us that story. And that's why we're going to be looking at the Gospel of Mark over the next few weeks, because we're going to be looking at the epic of Jesus. We'll close with prayer. Dear Father, we are grateful for your word, that you have not left yourself without witness, that you not only inspired it, you preserved it, that we can now read it along with our brothers and sisters around the world and across time, read the same story, the same narrative, so that we can all have the same mind that was in your Son, Jesus Christ, can be in us. I ask that as we read Mark over the coming weeks, that we would have the mind that was in Christ, that we wouldn't just have his doctrine on our lips, have his teachings on our mind, but that in our heart we would absorb the person of Christ. I ask all this in your name.